Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the US and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we share our insights and our experiences and knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
Today, we want to continue our conversation about organizational communication and talk specifically about an experience that you've likely already had, but probably haven't had words for: collective disturbance.
Yeah, along the lines of our living systems model that we've been talking about, communication really represents the flow of life in an organization. It's represented by the circulatory system in our body that connects every part of the body to every other part and conveys the nutrients needed for us to stay alive. So imagine a picture of the human body that depicts the parts of the vascular system as completely interconnected. That's the way things should be operating in an organization. Information should be flowing through every part of the organizational body.
But it reminds me of how elementary school kids play that game telephone, or maybe it's also called like whisper down the lane, or maybe in your generation it was telegraph, where one person whispers something into the ear of the person next to them, and then they whisper it into the ear of the person next to them, and it goes around the classroom, and eventually the last person says what they heard, and it sounds nothing like what the original statement was. And it's so funny how just messages can get so garbled and completely unintelligible as they get passed from person to person. And just because we grow up and we aren't playing that telephone game anymore doesn't mean that communication's gotten any easier. Communicating with other people in an organization is as complicated a process as we can imagine. And it involves minds, bodies, experience, memory, emotions, thoughts, intuitions, and beliefs. Like all of those things influence how the message gets transmitted.
And in organizations, there are so many barriers to communication. There are physical barriers, such as having geographically dispersed programs. There are psychological barriers related to each person's understanding and interpretation of what the other person means. And as you were reminding me of, in my generation, we called it whisper down the lane. As you reminded me of that, I was thinking of the joker in the class who would deliberately
Oh,
change the
yeah,
message.
yeah.
And then social barriers inherent in the structure of the organization based on status and power, and then philosophical barriers about underlying assumptions we make about things like what is right and wrong and good and bad. So as a result of this kind of complexity, communication of even simple messages between two people can go very wrong very easily.
Well, also because we communicate in so many different ways, right? There are some formal ways that we communicate, like meeting agendas, minutes, or other written documents. But there are also informal ways that communication is shared, like passing each other in the hallway, or making a phone call, or sending a text or an email.
We also convey information in the way we look, in our facial expressions, in our body posture. or in a meeting or in a face-to-face, person-to-person encounter. Since all of our organizations are built around fixed hierarchies that already exist, information travels up and down the hierarchy and then moves across horizontal levels within the hierarchy. So complicating this even further is that we're always conveying both cognitive and emotional information, verbally and non-verbally. And some of this will be deliberate and conscious, and some of it will be completely out of our awareness and unconscious.
So it also is, I think, helpful to think about like emotional tone. The emotional tone that the sender has really impacts how that message gets encoded. So does the emotional tone of the receiver, how that gets decoded. So given that complexity, we should think about and consider how many ways things can really go off the rails with regard to organizational communication. Um, and thinking about too, just like the barriers to accuracy. First, we think about, if I'm communicating something, I have to have the words available to me to encode the message. And if I put the words in a text or an email or document, then I have to be skillful as a writer. If I'm trying to also kind of get you to pick up not just the information, but the emotional content. Um, and if I can't really be bothered to write because that's too time consuming, so instead I send it to you through someone else, an intermediary, like an upper level manager wanting the staff to do something different. So, kind of telling the mid manager. And if I send that message through one or more people, then it's really vulnerable to being degraded. The information gets degraded and looks an awful lot like when we play telephone.
Yeah. And the more important the message is, the more potentially problematic and ambiguous it is, and the more powerful I am, the more you're going to use your interpretive skills to figure out what I really meant.
Mhm.
So your interpretations, like my message, will be affected by the differences between us. The more alike we are in this range of diversity, the more likely we are to share basic styles and meanings, and the more comfortable we may be with the asking each other for, what we really meant. What are the clarifications? On the other hand, the more different we are, the more open every communication is to misinterpretation, and the less likely it is that we're actually going to ask for clarification. And this is especially true when text or email is being used, which is most of us are just not gifted enough writers to be able to convey both emotional content and cognitive content so that the emotional part gets deleted. And that can pose a huge problem in communication.
Well, that's what emojis are for, Sandy, but but that's also not super professional and sometimes those are really open to interpretation too. So it means that nobody has to intentionally misconstrue information, right? Like the Joker kid in the class that you were describing before, it just happens. And the more stress and pressure that we feel when we're receiving the communication, the less likely we are to kind of accurately interpret the message. Why the words might be really clear, but the emotional content might be confusing. And so if I can't determine that the other person has actually received the message the way that I intended, then all kinds of things can go wrong. And some of the things that can go wrong can actually really negatively impact trust in our relationship. And that can go on for years. When I can't tell you how many times this has happened when I've asked my wife to convey a message to our daughter or vice versa. Like Laura and I have totally different communication styles. Think retired Army veteran versus therapist, right? And the conflict that has ensued with those miscommunications. And all of this happens without anyone intending any harm or even being consciously aware of the fact that it's happened. If you throw in somebody who deliberately wants to misinterpret or manipulate communication, then the result can be even worse.
Yeah. And that's kind of happening everywhere in the political scene today. For an organizational body to be healthy, information must be constantly flowing around the organization, up and down, back and forth. It's important to recognize that there are many forms of communication going on in any group at the same time, and not all of it is deliberate, conscious, or even recognized. So when communication goes underground, all kinds of trouble can occur. So we have to understand how that happens and why, and learn how to recognize it sooner rather than later, and know how to respond to it and get the flow of conscious communication going again.
Yeah, so this means that leaders have to learn how to move those barriers out of the way, the ones that are blocking the flow of information, and including making sure that people have the information they need to do their jobs. To know how to improve the flow of communication within an organization, we have to really understand what goes wrong in communication and develop some workable concepts, some strategies about how to get it back on track.
And it also means we need to look at the ways in which our organizations really become microcosms of the larger world in which they are embedded. Every single individual is a culture unto him or her or their self. We each interpret messages we receive through the lenses of our own experience and differ in all the ways we differ on age, gender, race, religion, ethnicity, education, experience, class, status, sexual orientation, gender identity, region, you name it. Human service delivery systems tend to have structures that are similar across client populations and across geographic regions. So let's take a moment to look at those characteristics.
Yeah, because statistically, based on our population, in the coming years, our workforce is going to become increasingly diverse. And this is really good and important, not the least of which is diversity trumps ability when we're solving problems, right? The more voices, the more perspectives, the better. The greater the complexity of the problem, the more we need a wide variety of perspectives and different interpretations, and for people to bring their varying abilities to that process. But it also means that we need to get better at communicating accurately with each other. And an important shift for people in positions of leadership is not just the ability to handle dissent when it occurs, but to actually look for it and encourage it. When people find their voice, it's frequently pretty clumsy. They're prone to say what's on their mind, and sometimes that can come off in ways they don't intend and even be offensive. And this is a problem that arises because when we don't teach staff the skills that are necessary for participating. And we don't do that even in childhood, right? In our schools, we're not teaching children how to voice their dissent. We're teaching them to stay in their seats and listen to the teachers, right? Even the report cards that we get home are not about any of the skills that we really understand now are going to be so important to what they are able to contribute as adults. So many adults don't have any idea how to voice their concerns clearly, openly, and respectfully. Um, they don't know how to persist when they've been ignored. They don't know how to listen deeply. They don't know how to welcome compromise or make concessions to get the job done. And they also don't really have the skills to synthesize lots of different points of view. Instead, we're sort of taught to dismiss them or argue over them. right? And come out the winner. There's a lot of competitive stuff that we teach our kids. Instead, they grow up thinking that every conversation then is a win-lose, and the situation that when it comes to complex group processes, it's all win or lose. And in these really high stakes situations that we're dealing with now, politically and socially, we need to be able to get to much more of a win-win outcome.
Yeah, once we understand just how difficult communication can be, we can begin to understand a very interesting phenomenon that most people have probably experienced but haven't had a name for it, a collective disturbance. The first description of a collective disturbance was written in 1954, and it was about the experience of staff in a mental hospital, in an asylum. So in sociological studies of the mental hospital and the democratic therapeutic community dating back to the 50s, it became really clear to researchers that individual patients who became the focus of attention on a psychiatric unit were those who were the subject of actually unexpressed staff conflict. And as soon as the staff conflict and communication blockades were surfaced, the individual patient's behavior improved.
Yeah, collective disturbances involving several patients or an entire unit in this description could often be traced back to conflicts that originated near the top of the institutional hierarchy. Right? That's often where these problems are stemming from. The intensity of emotional interpersonal conflict and the separation of that like cognitive and emotional content of information, they can trace that right back through the staff and into the patient community. So it's traveling down vertically, largely through nonverbal, unconscious, and informal communication networks. The staff and management conflicts usually seem to revolve around disagreements between the priorities of institutional purposes or like incompatibilities between a given purpose and some institutional need. So, like processes and priorities and policies.
Yeah, the way it works is that, as you said, a conflict originates usually somewhere higher up in a hierarchy, sometimes all the way at the top. And the knowledge about what the conflict is about, the cognitive information about it, splits off from the emotional aspects of the conflict that some people feel and other people do not. But the emotions, because of our nature, they start traveling down through the hierarchy and they take on a life of their own so that everyone gets caught up in the feelings without knowing anything about what it's about. So no one is able to identify what the problem actually is. And it keeps the feelings keep traveling downward, and the lowest level of the hierarchy become the canaries in the coal mine, as it's called. So in a family, it will be the children. In a hospital, it will be the patients. Whoever has the least power in the hierarchy will be then who acts it out.
And this happens really most frequently when there's conflict at the top. And often that conflict happens when there's organizational or institutional change that happens either from outside or inside the organization without enough knowledge of the implications for the change. So there's like
Right.
these conflicted
And as
feelings.
it keeps going, as it spreads
Yeah.
over time and people, uh, everything keeps getting worse. As the original description said, they wrote, the failure in function of each person is integrated with the failure in function of the next one and are integrated in such a way that the disorganization gains impetus like a snowball going downhill with increasing size, spread, and seriousness of effects.
So, listeners, I'm going to list some of the things that happen when this snowball rolls down, and I would not be surprised if you are experiencing some of them in your organization right now. Errors in technique, security problems, forgotten messages, increased absenteeism, increased withdrawal by key staff members, more incidents, problematic issues, right? Client complaints or customer complaints, injuries, staff complaints, staff getting preoccupied with the problems of or with other staff, increased sense of helplessness, missing or canceled meetings where there are breakdowns in communication, and an inability to make decisions, and just a general overall sense that something bad is going to happen.
Right. And all of this may be going on. Meanwhile, the people or parties that are actually in conflict, the people further up the hierarchy, do not have a clue. They do not consciously recognize what is going on. The dissociated feelings keep traveling down to the most vulnerable members of the community, who then act them out. The acting out escalates until the group finally, one hopes, this is the aim. They
Yeah.
finally recognize that this is not an individual problem. It's a collective problem. And it's likely, the most likely person to recognize that and bring it to the surface is someone who has been on vacation or has had some time off or is new to the system.
Yeah, those fresh eyes make it clearer. And if it's not attended to and resolved, the violence can actually get worse. And the way that it does get resolved is managers and staff have to sort of recognize and confront their unspoken conflicts and start to restore more integrated communication. And when they do this, they can kind of prevent or at least terminate the, collective disturbance that's happened. And then we see everything kind of go back to normal. And I have an example of this from a place where I worked, where it was a residential treatment center, and one of the staff members was injured by a young person, and this staff person had to take time off. She was out for a while. She had a really bad eye injury, and that was the result of having been hit in the face with a vacuum cleaner hose. And she, was out, and the ensuing weeks, people filled in for her. And what was happening though was, you know, over time, we started seeing more and more violence across the campus, not just in the dorm that she was in, but in all of them. And eventually the leadership team said, like, we need to call a staff meeting and find out what is happening with all this violence. And when they did, what they learned was that the staff were feeling furious with the leadership because when this person was injured, there was really no talking about it, no outreach to her, no, conversation with the team that was affected by her absence. And they were really feeling uncared for and unsafe. And the way that that was manifesting was the kids were acting that out. The kids were then perpetrating violence against each other and the staff all over the place. Once that communication happened and the feelings got identified and raised and then put back where they belonged, the violence decreased. The problem with the kids was no longer at the level that it had risen to.
These kinds of collective things happen everywhere. And the more stressed the organization, the more likely they are to occur. Collective disturbances frequently They illustrate that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They do not usually derive from anybody's malevolent desires, but as in this story, um, really nobody intended to do harm. I don't think either of us remembers why the leaders, who were usually caring individuals, did not communicate. Something else probably came up on the screen and seemed an emergency, and they dealt with it, but didn't do what they should have done. So, in part, these things readily occur because we remain largely oblivious of group dynamics and of collective unconscious processing. And compounding the problem is the reality, as we've been discussing, that communication among human beings is so multidimensional. Collective disturbances have a structure that people should know about. If you know what you're looking for, you may be able to identify it early enough before more trouble has been caused. You may be able to prevent the really destructive aspects of a collective disturbance that are much more likely to occur if it goes on and on and on and becomes a chronic collective disturbance like that our whole country is in right now.
Yeah, collective disturbances often follow a pattern. And the typical symptoms of an evolving group crisis that can be experienced by individuals across the community, they look kind of the same. Starts with a period of unease, with a rising level of anxiety, irritability, and general stress. And then the usual things that work to kind of take that down, they stop working. And then at that point, staff members generally look for an individual cause for the problem, either with themselves or a particular staff member who's lower in the organizational hierarchy, right? Scapegoating happens. And then there's often attention paid to the person who's identified as the problem. But as the problem evolves, the milieu gets more uncomfortable, and then it starts to become a problem that we see much more in a collective way. And that's when we can recognize this collective disturbance is happening. So, we are going to talk more after the break about how to prevent and combat the negative effects of collective disturbance. Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. We'll be back right after these messages.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And today we're focusing on organizational communication and what's called a collective disturbance. We're going to be talking about building a culture of candor as a way of preventing and combating the negative effects of collective disturbance. What often drives the collective disturbance is the emotional information that's been lost or miscommunicated that sends ripples of emotional dysregulation all the way through a system. So it's important that we think about how information is communicated, but also what information and how much information is communicated. And that, of course, starts with leadership.
So, I want to talk about this really great article that's very old, about the concept of a culture of candor. And it was written by James O'Toole and Warren Bennis in 2009. And they talk about this idea that we really need to develop a new metric for corporate leadership. And I think it also makes sense to apply this in the nonprofit and human service world too. But their idea is that this new metric should be this: the extent to which executives create organizations that are economically, ethically, and socially sustainable. And transparency is the fundamental first step in kind of making that come to life. When they talk about transparency, they mean a lot more than kind of the standard business definition of that term, right? Which is about full disclosure of financial information to investors, right? When we talk about corporate transparency, that's really the definition that, everyone kind of holds. Um, but that honesty is obviously necessary, but that narrow interpretation about it just being the, financial information that gets published, it produces a really unhealthy focus on legal compliance, and it excludes this really equally important ethical concern and the needs of all of the people who have a stake in the organization to also have that information. Worse, it's like predicated on this blanket assumption that a company, and in nonprofits, this is like the equivalent of their annual report, that they can be transparent to their stakeholders, but not be transparent to the people inside the organization.
The thing is, no organization can be honest with the public if it's not honest with itself. So we need to define transparency broadly as the degree to which information flows freely within an organization among managers and employees and outward to stakeholders. I think it's also important to think about the power of informal leaders, not just formal leaders. Many of our listeners may not be in formal positions of authority, but may be leading as members of their teams by virtue of their personalities or experience or their skills. So O'Toole and Bennis outlined 6 steps for creating a culture of candor, which we're going to describe in a minute. But I want to reflect back on our first season of this podcast when we spoke with Dr. Jennifer Fried, who talked about her research on whistleblowing and what she calls organizational courage. Her work really aligns with the strategies that O'Toole and Bennis suggest. And that includes being able to speak truth to power, to have an organization where people with contrary opinions are actually rewarded, where we practice having difficult and unpleasant conversations.
Yeah, also where in organizations people diversify their sources of information. So they're not just getting it from one source or one funnel, right? I'm thinking about those echo chambers that we find ourselves in. The 5th is admitting mistakes. And then the 6th is really having the board of directors begin the process of building an organizational architecture that supports candor through its hiring of a CEO. And that's kind of unnatural, I think, in a lot of ways, because most of the people who end up in these leadership executive suite positions are people who have climbed the corporate ladder by hoarding information. So, the candidates that rise to the top are often not the people who have a lot of skill or practice with creating a culture of candor.
What was valuable, I think, about their work was that they also talk about what makes it hard to do it, hard for organizations to create a culture of candor. And they cited what is actually a relatively obscure study from the 1980s in which 2 organizational theorists, Robert Blake and Jane Mouton, they looked at NASA's findings on the human factors in airline accidents. The researchers had placed existing cockpit, cruise pilot, co-pilot, and navigators in-flight simulators and tested them to see how they would respond during the critical 30 to 45 seconds between the first part of a potential accident and the moment it would occur. The stereotypical take charge pilots who acted immediately on their gut instinct made the wrong decisions far more often than the more inclusive pilots who said to their whole crew that was with them something to the effect of, "We got a problem. How do you read it?" before choosing a course of action.
Yeah, so this study really demonstrated that the pilots' habitual style for interacting with their crews played a big role in determining whether those crew members would provide them with important information during a crisis. The pilots who made the right choices routinely had these open exchanges with their crew members. And the study also showed that crew members who regularly worked with those decisive take charge pilots were much less willing to intervene, even when they had information that would have saved the plane. So, in creating presence, we know that people are less likely to voice their opinions if they don't feel like those opinions are welcomed, if they don't feel encouraged or safe to do it. So, we actually prescribe the self framework, which is safety, emotions, loss, and future, and a consensus building structure for problem solving. And we push people in their teams to use that, to practice it. We know that when there's a crisis, you might not have time for a fully fleshed out discussion, right? Where you go through the 4 categories that we suggest with safety, emotions, loss, and future. And we know there might not be time for a, hour-long conversation to come to consensus. But if teams have had the practice of using those strategies and they've had then the relational experience of being heard, sharing dissenting opinions, having their ideas welcomed, they're far more likely to volunteer them in a critical situation. So, in creating presence, kind of like bringing a trauma informed lens to this, what we have really come to understand is that it's a way of normalizing and practicing speaking truth to power and practicing those unpleasant conversations that uh, you know this article is suggesting.
A second kind of transparency problem is groupthink, which we dedicated a lot of time to in a previous episode. It means that shared values and assumptions play a positive and necessary role in holding any group together. And when a team of senior managers suffers from collective denial and self-deception, meaning when they can't unearth and question their own shared assumptions, they can't innovate or make course corrections effectively. And that often leads to business huge problems and ethical disasters. So this is also why it's so important to practice having difficult and unpleasant conversations and why we facilitate those conversations in our CP coaching model.
Yeah, when Bennis and O'Toole were interviewing managers, they said that the most common metaphor they heard managers use to describe their culture is a mushroom farm. And I thought this was hilarious. Because what they meant was people around here are kept in the dark and fed manure. And I feel like that is just so, it's like poetically perfect. They actually asked 154 executives to describe their company culture, and they asked them to do it kind of using weather as a metaphor for describing it. Um, and 63 out of those 154 leaders described their company culture as opaque. And then the remaining 37% or more said, they chose like clouds over breaking sunshine as a way to describe communication at their firms, right? So no one talked about it being crystal clear or bright and sunny. And we know organizational transparency makes sense, like rationally, ethically, and it makes businesses run more efficiently and more effectively. But leaders really resist it. Even despite those realities, because it goes so against the grain of group behavior, and in some ways it goes against human nature to be so transparent.
Let's talk about why it runs against human nature. Group leaders try to hoard and control information because they believe it's a source of managers' power. Managers sometimes believe that access to information is a prerequisite of power, of benefit that separates their privileged status from other people and from other staff, particularly. This behavior suggests that such leaders apparently feel they're smarter than their followers and that only they need or would know how to use sensitive and complex information. Some even like this approach because it allows them actually to hide embarrassing mistakes and to hide from the fact that they really aren't smarter.
Right. And then have to sort of face the question of like, well, why am I here? Lots of avoidance in this category. There's a third type of transparency problem too, and that's one that occurs with boards of directors, right? So they have the responsibility to provide genuine oversight over an organization. And an alarming number of board members today seem to come under what's called the shimmer effect. And the shimmer effect is like you hire someone who's really charismatic in a CEO or executive director position. And because they're kind of bright and shiny, you get distracted and they like kind of get away with murder, or at the very minute, maybe not murder, but definitely outrageous greed. And in creating presence, I've worked with a lot of boards of directors who've really seen their primary role as kind of just looking at the financial and legal survival of an organization, right? That's kind of what they're tuned into. But one of the boards that I've worked with learned the lesson about the shimmer effect with two really poor executive hires over the course of 3 years. So two CEOs who came and went within a really short period of time. One of the candidates who they hired had offered like really shiny connections to big funders. So this was someone who sort of promised that she had access to lots of people who could turn the financial gears in this nonprofit. But she ended up being fired within 10 months for abusive behavior towards other people on the executive team. So that was, you would hope that they would have learned from the shimmer effect that round. But no, the second, who replaced the first, was actually charged with sexually abusing a young person in his former role as a priest. And both of these CEOs were really appealing as candidates for the job of CEO because of the big promises that they made about, taking the fundraising responsibility off the shoulders of this nonprofit board. Um, but it also really reinforces, I think, the need to seek out diverse sources of information, right? So not just like avoid the shimmer effect, but also when you're on the board of directors and you're interviewing candidates, not just looking at, what the candidate is telling you, but also asking about, how other people who've worked with that person have experienced them. Um, the fourth recommendation that the authors make for building a culture of candor is this, looking for or seeking out diverse sources of information. And I feel like these two situations really might have been avoided if they had taken that route.
your story and what I have experienced so often of the shimmer effect and then the actual corruption of a board of directors, it's too common to just ignore. And there seems to be, what I really question is the fundamental problem with the structure, particularly in the nonprofit world. It does not seem to work very well. A way that we've seen leadership avoid these pitfalls is an example of Kent Theory, who's a CEO of DaVita, a company that delivers dialysis treatment. And his approach was to systematically collect data and solicit candid feedback from his employees, from his ex-employees, from his customers and suppliers, in order to avoid making all these mistakes we've been talking about. He actively sought out bad news, and he rewarded employees who gave it to him to reinforce trust. And this is a great example of rewarding contrarians that O'Toole and Bennis and our friend Jennifer Fried suggest. By doing this, he was probably able to correct practices that employees identified as problematic issues that, if they were left unchecked, could come back to really haunt the company.
Yeah, but it's really hard to ask for bad news, right? We talked a lot in our last episode about silencing dissent. And I think, expanding on that conversation it's helpful to think about one of the reasons that happens is because when leaders hear about problems or hear about things that are not going well, they often feel like they are left holding the bag alone to solve the problem. And when we think about how toxic that situation is and how psychologically, like, of course, people are going to want to avoid hearing bad news. Of course, they're going to want to quiet the voices that are identifying problems, because if you don't know what to do to solve a problem, then you might be revealed as incompetent, and nobody wants that. So in creating presence, we really talk a lot about having these conversations in a way that allows us to avoid blame, right? You've said so many times, Sandy, like, the first thing we do when a problem arises is try to figure out whose fault it is, right? And then we can scapegoat them, and then we can all throw our hands up and and wail about the problem.
Doing whatever we were doing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But doing trauma-informed practice and disrupting collective disturbance and creating a culture of candor often also means saying, I don't know, and asking for help. Because in the absence of that, when people feel cornered, when they feel sort of trapped in this space of being, revealed as incompetent, they can do some really bad things to try to, maneuver their way out of it. And I think that also can result in some of the corruption that we see in the corporate world and also in the nonprofit or human service world.
Remember Philip Zimbardo
Yes.
and his very controversial, but ended up having enormous impact, famous and controversial prison experiment from 1971. And in light of 2 decades of social psychological research, he had concluded that almost all of us are susceptible to being drawn over to the dark side, because behavior is determined more by situational forces and group dynamics than by our inherent nature. Plus, it's really horribly easy to create situations and systems in which good people can't resist the temptation to do bad things.
Yeah, this experiment that he did, the famous prison study, was to take college students and assign them the role of either prisoner or guard. And you'll help me fill in the gaps a little bit, but um, the real weight of the study was that he had to pull the plug on it after just a few days
Yep.
because the abuse that was happening was so out of control, and the people who were assigned these roles started behaving in ways that were not at all aligned with their own morality or their own, identities.
Right. And very few people of these young people were able to resist. Some could. So on a more hopeful note, what Zimbardo shows is that we can just as easily redesign systems that lead to more virtuous behavior. He demonstrated that ethical problems and organizations originate not with the few bad apples, but with the barrel makers, the leaders who create or maintain the systems in which participants are encouraged to do wrong. So the managerial implications of this are enormous. Instead of wasting millions of dollars on ethics courses designed to exhort employees to do the right thing, it'd be far more effective to create corporate cultures in which people are rewarded for doing the right things.
Yeah, I feel like that is such a simple concept, but so antithetical to how things work right now. And I think, in creating presence, we do a lot of work around rules and norms. And the big difference between rules is that they are imposed from outside. And I know, Sandy, you and I have this in common. We both sort of have the rules are meant to be broken attitude. So when it comes from a place of authority, it's it's somewhat effective
Well, the
in
rules
kind
are
of.
often so stupid.
Well, exactly. That's why we break them. But norms, right? Norms come from the group itself. Norms come from our interactions and relationships. And so they're much more effective at holding us accountable. Another part of, creating presence and good trauma-informed practice is creating the shared or collective investment in leading, right? So nothing that happens within an organization should ever rest on the shoulders of one person. Information needs to be shared so that people can use it to help inform decisions. And so that's what we're talking about, and kind of bringing our work in alignment with the O'Toole and Bennis concepts of creating a culture of candor. Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to be in a healthy society and how to construct those. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.